The Texas sun scorched the earth like the fires of hell itself in June 1863, and beneath that merciless sky, a woman named Abigail picked cotton with fingers that had forgotten softness. She was 32 years old, but her eyes held the weight of 100 lifetimes. Those eyes had seen things that would break most souls: the whip, the chain, the auction block, the separation of mother from child. But what made Abigail different was this: her eyes still burned with something the masters feared more than rebellion itself. They burned with memory. For 14 years, she had served the Thornton plantation in eastern Texas. 14 years under the iron fist of Catherine Thornton, a woman whose cruelty was legend among the enslaved. Catherine was a contradiction wrapped in silk, a lady who quoted scripture while ordering flesh torn from backs, who hosted tea parties in the afternoon and supervised whippings by evening. To the outside world, she was Southern gentility personified. Behind closed doors, she was a monster in petticoats. But here's what no one knew yet. Abigail had been learning to read in secret, and with literacy came dangerous ideas. Ideas about Nat Turner, about Harriet Tubman, about Denmark Vesey. Ideas about resistance, ideas about justice. The enslaved woman who served Catherine's tea had been educating herself in revolution, one forbidden page at a time. But Catherine had no idea what was growing in the mind of the woman she thought she owned. The plantation had a tree. Everyone called it the whipping tree, a massive live oak that stood 50 yards from the main house, its thick branches spreading like the arms of judgment. The tree's bark bore rope scars. Its roots had drunk the blood of countless victims. It was Catherine's chosen stage for punishment, positioned so every enslaved person in the fields could see and hear what happened to those who displeased her. Abigail had been brought to that tree more times than she could count. 5 lashes for serving dinner 3 minutes late, 15 for a wrinkle in a tablecloth, 20 for meeting Catherine's eyes a second too long, each punishment delivered by Silas Gray, the overseer, a man who smiled while he worked. And Catherine always watched, standing close enough to see every welt rise on exposed flesh, her face serene as if observing a pleasant garden party. But what happened next would make history. In April 1863, Catherine accused Abigail of stealing a valuable brooch, a family heirloom that had gone missing from her dressing room. The accusation was false. Abigail had been in the kitchen all day with witnesses who could verify her whereabouts. But truth didn't matter to Catherine Thornton. She needed someone to blame, and Abigail had always been her favorite target. The punishment was set for the following morning, 25 lashes at the whipping tree. That night, something crystallized in Abigail's mind. She reached a point of no return. She could continue to endure, to survive through submission, to hope that freedom would arrive before she was completely broken. Or she could act, knowing that action might mean death, but that death itself might be preferable to perpetual degradation. The next morning dawned gray and heavy. Abigail was led to the tree by Silas Gray, his face already showing anticipation. Other enslaved people were pulled from their work to witness the punishment, Catherine's pedagogical theater of suffering. They gathered in a reluctant semicircle, their faces carefully blank, trained through years of survival to show nothing. Catherine arrived dressed in a pale blue dress, carrying a parasol to protect her complexion. She positioned herself 10 feet from the tree, close enough to see everything, far enough to avoid blood splatter on her fine clothes. She nodded to Silas, giving permission to begin. Abigail was brought to the tree, her wrists bound with rough rope, tied to a low branch that forced her to stand on her toes. Her back was bared. Silas tested the whip with practice swings through the humid morning air, each crack a promise of pain to come. But as Silas drew back his arm for the first strike, something extraordinary happened. Abigail turned her head as far as the ropes would allow and looked directly at Catherine, not with downcast eyes, not with a blank stare of endurance, but with a gaze of such burning intensity and accusation that Catherine actually stepped backward. Then Abigail spoke. Her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the assembled crowd with perfect clarity. She said only 4 words, but they were 4 words that would change everything. God sees your sin. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Even the birds stopped singing. Catherine's face went through rapid transformations, shock, fury, then something else. Fear, perhaps. Or the uncomfortable stirring of a conscience she'd buried beneath layers of privilege and self-justification. Silas stood frozen, whip raised, looking to Catherine for guidance. But the plantation mistress seemed momentarily paralyzed, her parasol trembling in her grip. Catherine recovered with visible effort, her face hardening into a mask of rage. 40 lashes, she said, her voice tight and controlled. This slave needs to learn that silence is a virtue, and that presuming to speak the word of God is the gravest blasphemy. The whip came down with a sound like a gunshot. A line of fire opened across Abigail's back. She gasped, but did not scream. The second lash followed, then the third, each one adding another stripe of agony. But even as blood began to flow and soak into her rough cotton dress, Abigail did not beg for mercy. She did not apologize. She simply endured. By the 20th lash, Silas was sweating from exertion. By the 30th, some watching had tears streaming down their faces, though they dared not make a sound. By the 40th, Abigail's back was a landscape of torn flesh, and she had finally lost consciousness, her body hanging limply from the ropes. Catherine watched every lash with an expression difficult to read. There was satisfaction, certainly, the grim pleasure of power exercised without restraint. But there was also something else. Those 4 words had burrowed into her mind like splinters. God sees your sin. When it ended, Silas cut Abigail down. 2 women carried her limp body back to the quarters. Catherine retreated to the big house, claiming a headache. She tried to read, tried to occupy herself, but found her attention wandering. The day felt somehow off-kilter, as if the natural order had been subtly disrupted. Here's what Catherine didn't know. She had just made the worst mistake of her life. In the slave quarters, the women tended to Abigail with practiced skill. They cleaned her shredded back, applied poultices made from herbs, wrapped her in clean rags. Abigail drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days, her body fighting fever and infection. During those 3 days of delirium, something solidified in Abigail's spirit. The whipping had not broken her, it had clarified her. She emerged with a strange calm, a certainty that had not been there before. She knew she would not die as a slave. She would either die in the act of resistance, or she would live to see freedom. But she would never again submit to Catherine Thornton's cruelty without fighting back. On the 4th day, an elderly enslaved man named Solomons came to visit her. Solomon was cautious by nature, having survived 7 decades through intelligence and discretion. But even he sensed that the moment for caution was passing. "You know what you did, don't you?" Solomon said quietly. "You broke the spell of fear. Every slave on this plantation heard what you said to Miss Catherine. That's dangerous, child. Dangerous and precious." Abigail nodded slowly. "I can't go back to how things were." Solomon leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There's talk. Talk that's been growing louder. The war isn't going well for the Confederacy. Change is coming. Question is, do we wait for it or do we help it along?" This was as close to open rebellion as Solomon had ever come. "What are you saying?" Abigail asked. "I'm saying there's folks on this plantation and neighboring ones who are tired of waiting. There's been meetings in the woods at night, plans being made, plans to run. Not just one or two people, but maybe 30, 40 people from 3 different plantations, all moving together. When? Not yet. Could be weeks, could be months. But when it happens, you should know. You should have the choice. Abigail's mind raced. The idea of escape ignited something in her chest. But she also thought about Catherine Thornton, about the whipping tree, about all the accumulated cruelty she had witnessed. A part of her, a part that frightened her with its intensity, wanted something more than escape. It wanted justice. Over the following weeks, as Abigail's back slowly healed, leaving a network of raised scars that would mark her forever, she returned to her duties in the big house. Catherine treated her with renewed coldness, piling on extra work. But Abigail had learned to school her features into perfect submission while her mind worked on entirely different problems. She began to observe the plantation's rhythms with new attention. She noted when Silas made his rounds, when Catherine's husband, George Wayne, traveled for business, when Catherine was most likely to be alone. She memorized the locations of keys, the schedules of other house slaves, the patterns of daily life. She gathered information like a squirrel gathering nuts for winter, knowing that knowledge itself was power. Then, in late May, something happened that would prove catalytic. George Thornton received word that his brother had been killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia. He would need to travel to oversee family affairs, a journey that would take him away for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. Catherine would be left in charge with only Silas and the house slaves for company. The night before George's departure, Abigail overheard an argument through the thin walls. George expressed concern about leaving Catherine alone, suggesting she should stay with relatives in Houston. Catherine refused absolutely. "The slaves are cowed," she said with utter confidence. "That whipping I gave to Abigail in April set the right tone. There hasn't been a whisper of trouble since. You worry too much, George." George departed the next morning, and the plantation settled into a new rhythm under Catherine's sole authority. But Catherine had failed to notice the subtle changes. The enslaved had become quieter, more inward, communicating through glances rather than words. Solomon's secret meetings grew more frequent. Information flowed through invisible channels. The network of resistance was expanding, becoming more organized, and the date for the planned escape was being moved up. In mid-June, on a moonless night, Solomon came to Abigail with news. The escape would happen in 10 days. Approximately 40 people would attempt to run together, moving quickly toward the north where Union forces were advancing. "You need to decide now," Solomon told her. "Once we go, there's no turning back." Abigail felt the weight of the decision pressing down. Escape meant risking everything. But staying meant continuing to live under Catherine's cruelty. As she contemplated the plan, another idea began to form in her mind, an idea that was dangerous, possibly insane, but which answered something deep in her soul that had been awakened by Catherine's years of cruelty. "I'll go with you," Abigail told Solomon, "but I have something I need to do first. Something that needs to happen before I leave this place." Solomon looked at her with concern and understanding. "What are you planning, child?" Abigail met his eyes steadily. "Justice. Just one small piece of justice before we run toward freedom." The days leading up to the escape were charged with tension only those involved could feel. To Catherine and Silas, the plantation appeared to be running smoothly. But beneath this surface, an entirely different reality was taking shape. Abigail moved through her duties with particular care, maintaining the perfect facade of submission that had been demanded of her for 14 years. But every action was performed with heightened awareness. She noted that Catherine had taken to keeping a small pistol in her nightstand. She observed that Catherine slept poorly, often waking to light lamps and write letters. On the afternoon of June 24th, 3 days before the planned escape, Abigail was cleaning Catherine's bedroom when she found something that would prove instrumental to her plan. Tucked into a small jewelry box was a key she'd never seen before. It was larger than other keys, made of heavy iron. It took her a moment to realize what it might unlock. The chains, the punishment chains that Silas kept in a storage building near the whipping tree. Abigail's hand trembled slightly. She had not fully formed her plan until this moment. But seeing this key, an idea crystallized with sudden clarity. It was audacious and terrifying, almost certainly doomed to failure. But it called to something in her spirit that would not be denied. She palmed the key with practiced subtlety and slipped it into her apron pocket. That evening, she made a wax impression using a technique Solomon had taught her. The next morning, while Catherine was at church, Abigail gave the key to Solomon, along with the impression. "Can you make a copy?" she asked. Solomon examined it carefully. "It'll take a day, maybe two. But Abigail, what are you planning? This is the kind of thing that gets people killed." "I know," Abigail said, "but some things matter more than safety." 2 days later, on the evening of June 26th, the night before the planned escape, Solomon delivered the copied key to Abigail. Along with it, he brought final instructions for the escape. The group would gather at midnight in the woods beyond the eastern cotton fields. "You're still planning to come with us?" Solomon asked, though his tone suggested he knew the answer was complicated. "I'll be there," Abigail said, "but I'll be coming last. There's something I have to do first, and it might take some time. Don't wait for me if I'm not there when the group needs to move." Solomon wanted to argue, but he recognized the futility. Instead, he simply embraced her. "Whatever you're going to do," he said quietly, "do it quickly and get out. Freedom won't mean anything if you're dead." That night, Abigail could not sleep. She lay on her pallet, listening to the breathing of the other women around her, thinking about what the next day would bring. She was not afraid exactly. Fear seemed too simple. It was more a kind of crystalline clarity, a sense that she was moving towards something inevitable, something that could no longer be denied. The next day, June 27th, 1863, began like any other day on the Thornton plantation. The sun rose hot and bright. Abigail and the other house slaves began their daily routines. Catherine came down for breakfast at 8, and Abigail served her coffee and biscuits with perfect, practiced efficiency. But this morning, Abigail had added something to Catherine's coffee, a preparation Solomon had given her, made from roots and herbs known to enslaved healers for inducing deep sleep without causing permanent harm. It was a mercy, in a way. What Abigail planned would be easier if Catherine was not fully conscious for the initial stages. Catherine finished breakfast and retired to her sitting room. Within 30 minutes, she was feeling drowsy. She lay down on the settee, intending to rest for just a few minutes. Within 10 minutes, she was deeply asleep. Abigail watched from the doorway, then moved with swift purpose. She recruited 2 other house slaves, Miriam and Esther, who had suffered their own share of Catherine's cruelty and had already agreed to join the escape. Together, the 3 women carried Catherine's unconscious body out of the house, moving quickly across the grounds toward the storage building near the whipping tree. The storage building was unlocked. Inside, they found the chains that Silas used for punishment, heavy iron shackles connected by thick links. Working together, they secured Catherine to the central post, her wrists bound above her head, in a position eerily similar to how countless slaves had been bound at the tree. They did not hurt her. They did not strike her or abuse her while she was unconscious. This was about something different than mere revenge. Once Catherine was secured, Abigail sent Miriam and Esther back to the house with instructions to continue their normal duties, as if nothing had happened. Silas was overseeing work in the far fields and wouldn't return until evening. This gave Abigail a window of several hours. She sat in the storage building and waited for Catherine to wake up. It took about 2 hours. When Catherine finally stirred and opened her eyes, her first reaction was confusion, then disbelief, then rapidly mounting panic as she realized her situation. She was chained in her own storage building, her wrists raw against iron shackles, her expensive dress already soiled. "Abigail." Catherine's voice was hoarse, disbelieving. "What is the meaning of this? Release me immediately. Do you have any idea what they'll do to you? They'll hang you. They'll make an example that will be remembered for generations." Abigail stood slowly and walked to stand directly in front of Catherine. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost conversational. "Do you remember what you said when you had me whipped for the stolen brooch? The brooch that turned up a week later in your own jewelry box, exactly where you had misplaced it. You said I needed to learn my place. You said the whipping would be educational." Catherine's face went through rapid expressions: fury, confusion, and beneath it all, genuine fear. "This is madness. You cannot possibly think you'll get away with this." "Charles won't return for weeks, if he returns at all," Abigail interrupted, using George's first name with deliberate disrespect. "The war is not going well for your Confederacy. The world you've built your life on is crumbling, Catherine Thornton. You just haven't realized it yet." "I will see you dead for this," Catherine hissed, "slowly and painfully dead, you and everyone who helped you." Abigail reached into her apron pocket and pulled out something that made Catherine's eyes widen with recognition and horror. The whip that Silas used at the tree, the same whip that had torn Abigail's back open 3 months earlier. "For 14 years," Abigail said quietly, "I have watched you inflict suffering on people who had no power to stop you, no recourse to justice, no hope of anyone holding you accountable. You beat Hannah so badly her back will be scarred for life, then sold her away from her family. You had Patience whipped until she couldn't stand, an old woman who had done nothing but try to save a life. You separated children from mothers, husbands from wives, all without a second thought because you believed you had the right, because you believed we weren't fully human." Catherine was shaking now, her aristocratic composure finally cracking. "Please," she said, perhaps the first time she had ever spoken that word to a slave as anything other than a command. "Please don't do this. I'll give you money. I'll write you freedom papers. You'll give me nothing," Abigail said, "because you have nothing that I want except one thing: justice. Just a small measure of justice before I leave this place forever." She raised the whip and Catherine screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the storage building. But Abigail did not strike. Instead, she lowered the whip and looked at Catherine with an expression that was harder to read than fury or hatred. It was something closer to pity. "I'm not going to whip you to death," Abigail said. "I'm not even going to whip you as many times as you've had me whipped. I'm going to give you exactly 10 lashes, one for every year I've been on this plantation. And then I'm going to leave you here alive, so you can think about what it feels like to be powerless, to be at someone else's mercy, to know that your pain means nothing to the person inflicting it." The first lash fell with the same terrible crack that Abigail had heard so many times before, but from the other side. The leather struck Catherine's back through the fine fabric of her dress, and the plantation mistress screamed, a sound of shock and pain that seemed to echo off the wooden walls. Abigail felt the weight of the whip in her hand, the resistance as it connected with flesh. Something complex moved through her chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense of cosmic balance being momentarily restored. She counted aloud as she delivered each lash, her voice steady. 2, 3, 4. Each number marked not just a strike of the whip, but a memory, a specific instance of cruelty that Catherine had inflicted, a face of someone who had suffered under her authority. With the 5th lash, Abigail thought of Hannah, sold away and lost. With the 6th, she thought of patience broken by an undeserved whipping. With the 7th, She remembered her own mother, Ruth, torn from her arms by a system Catherine enthusiastically supported. Catherine's screams evolved into sobbing pleas between lashes. "Stop! Please stop! I'm sorry! I'm sorry!" The words tumbled out in a desperate cascade, perhaps the first genuine apology she had ever offered to an enslaved person. But Abigail did not stop until she reached 10. The final lash fell, and then she lowered the whip, her arm trembling slightly from exertion and emotion. Catherine hung in her chains, her dress torn and bloodied, her face streaked with tears, her aristocratic composure completely shattered. She looked nothing like the imperious plantation mistress who had ruled with such absolute conviction. She looked instead like what she actually was, a human being experiencing pain and terror, stripped of the social constructs that had protected and elevated her. Abigail stood before her for a long moment, breathing heavily, the whip still in her hand. She felt many things. Grim satisfaction, yes, but also a kind of sadness. The whipping had not changed anything fundamental about the world. It had not freed the other slaves still laboring in the fields. It had not brought back those who had been sold away or killed. It had not undone 14 years of cruelty. It was simply one small act of resistance, one reversal of power dynamics that would be remembered but would not alter the larger structures of oppression. "Do you understand now?" Abigail asked quietly. "Do you understand what it feels like? This is a fraction of what you've inflicted on others, Catherine Thornton. 10 lashes compared to the hundreds you've ordered over the years. 10 lashes compared to the lifetimes of suffering you've caused." Catherine could only sob in response, her body shaking with pain and shock. Abigail set the whip down and took a step closer to the woman who had tormented her for so long. "I want you to remember this feeling," Abigail said, her voice low and intense. "I want you to remember it every day for the rest of your life. Remember what it's like to be powerless. Remember what it's like to have someone else control whether you feel pain or relief, whether you live or die. Remember that we are human beings, Catherine. Every single one of us that you've beaten and sold and degraded. We are human beings with the same capacity to suffer that you have." She turned to leave, but Catherine's voice stopped her. "You'll never make it," Catherine said, her words thick with pain but still carrying venom. "They'll hunt you down like dogs. Silas will organize pursuit, and they'll bring you back in chains. And when they do, I'll make sure your death is so slow and agonizing that you'll beg for the mercy of a simple whipping." Abigail looked back over her shoulder at the broken woman chained to the post. "Maybe you're right," she said. "Maybe we won't make it. Maybe freedom is still years away, or maybe it will never come at all. But at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have chosen to run toward hope rather than stay still in despair. What will you have, Catherine, when this war ends and your entire world collapses around you? What will you have? You'll have memories of cruelty and the knowledge that you used your power for nothing but causing pain." She walked out of the storage building without looking back, leaving Catherine chained and sobbing in the dim interior. Outside, the afternoon sun blazed overhead. The plantation was eerily quiet. Most field slaves were too far away to have heard Catherine's screams. The house slaves who knew what was happening had been instructed to stay inside and maintain the fiction that everything was normal. Abigail went to the slave quarters and gathered her few possessions, a spare dress, a small cloth bag with bread and dried meat, and a wooden carving her mother had made before being sold away. Everything she owned fit into a bundle that could be carried in one hand. 14 years of her life reduced to objects in a single cloth sack. She changed into rougher field worker clothing, more practical for traveling. Then she went to find Solomon, who was waiting near the edge of the quarters. "Is it done?" he asked simply. "It's done," Abigail confirmed. "Catherine is secured in the storage building. I left her alive as I said I would." She'll be found eventually. Silas will start looking when she doesn't appear for supper. But by then, we should have several hours head start." Solomon nodded slowly. "The others are already gathering. Everyone who's coming is ready. We need to leave within the hour." They walked together toward the meeting point, moving through the familiar landscape that had been both home and prison for so many years. Abigail found herself looking at everything with new eyes, knowing she would never see it again. The rows of cotton plants, the big house, the whipping tree with its spreading branches. All of it would soon be part of her past. The group gathered in the woods beyond the eastern fields was larger than Abigail had expected. 37 people ranging from teenagers to elderly folks like Solomon. They carried few possessions, traveling light for speed. Among them were entire families, couples holding hands with quiet determination, individuals with nothing left to lose. There were field workers with scarred backs, house slaves who had lived in close proximity to their oppressors and understood exactly how fragile and human those oppressors were. Skilled craftsmen who had watched their labor enrich others while they remained in bondage. Women who had endured sexual violence and the theft of their children. Each person had their own story of suffering and survival, their own reasons for choosing the dangerous path of escape over continued enslavement. As night fell, Solomon gathered everyone for a brief moment of prayer and encouragement. He spoke in the coded language of spirituals and biblical references that enslaved people had used for generations to speak of freedom without alerting white listeners. "We are crossing Jordan tonight," he said, using the metaphor that had long represented escape to freedom. "The river is deep and the current is strong, but there's a promised land on the other side. Some of us might not make it across, some might be pulled under. But those who reach the other shore will be free, and they'll remember those who tried." There were murmured amens and quiet affirmations. Then, as the last light faded from the sky and darkness settled over the plantation, they began to move. They traveled in small clusters rather than one large group, spacing themselves to avoid drawing attention. The first cluster moved out, disappearing into the woods, followed by the second, then the third. Abigail was in one of the last clusters to leave, along with Solomon, Miriam, Esther, and 3 others. As they moved through the darkening woods, she could hear the sounds of the plantation fading behind her, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill, the barking of dogs. Ahead lay unknown territory, danger and possibility in equal measure. They traveled through the night, moving as quickly as the terrain and the slowest members would allow. They crossed streams by feeling for stones in the darkness, pushed through underbrush that tore at clothing and skin, navigated by stars and the guidance of those who knew the route. Every sound seemed amplified: the snap of a twig, the call of a night bird, the rustle of some animal in the brush. Each one could be a sign of pursuit, or simply the normal sounds of a forest at night. As dawn approached, they had covered approximately 15 miles from the Thornton plantation. They were tired, feet bleeding from rough travel, knowing that pursuit would begin in earnest once Catherine was discovered. But they had made it through the first night, and that was something. They found a hidden ravine where they could rest during the day, posting guards to watch for pursuers while the rest tried to sleep. Abigail found it difficult to rest despite exhaustion. Her mind kept returning to the image of Catherine chained in the storage building, to the feel of the whip in her hand, to the screams that had echoed off wooden walls. She wondered if she had done the right thing, if that act of resistance had been worth the risk it posed, not just to herself, but to everyone escaping with her. Solomon, resting nearby, seemed to sense her troubled thoughts. He moved closer and spoke in a low voice. "You questioning what you did back there?" "Not questioning," Abigail said. "Just thinking about it. Wondering what it means, what it changes." "It changes what it changes," Solomon said with oblique wisdom. "Maybe it don't change the big world, but it changed something in you. and maybe it changed something in Catherine Thornton too. Whether that change takes root or withers, only time will tell. But every slave who heard about what you did, every person running with us tonight, they'll carry that story. They'll know that someone stood up, that someone made their oppressor feel even a fraction of what we felt. That matters. Does it matter enough to justify putting everyone at risk? Abigail asked. Solomon considered this. You didn't force anyone to run. Everyone here made their own choice. Some chose to run because the war is creating opportunities. Some because they couldn't stand another day in bondage. And some because they heard about a woman who stood up to her mistress and lived to tell the tale. Your action gave people hope, Abigail. Hope is dangerous, but it's also what keeps us human. They rested through the day, taking turns sleeping and keeping watch. As the sun climbed higher, they could hear distant sounds that might have been dogs, might have been pursuit, or might have been nothing but their own fear making them hear threats in every noise. By mid-afternoon, they had to make a decision: continue resting and risk being caught, or move out earlier than planned and risk being spotted in daylight. The guides made the call to move. They would travel through terrain heavily wooded enough to provide cover even in daylight, and the risk of staying in one place was becoming greater than the risk of moving. The group roused themselves, gathered their few possessions, and continued their journey north. The second day of travel was harder than the first in almost every way. Exhaustion weighed on them like a physical burden. Feet that were bleeding the night before were now infected and swollen. Hunger gnawed at empty stomachs as their small food supplies ran low. And hovering over everything was the constant fear of pursuit, the knowledge that every hour brought them closer to freedom, but also deeper into territory where recapture might mean death rather than a return to bondage. They moved through pine forests and across open meadows, always choosing the path with the most cover. They waded through streams to throw off dogs tracking their scent. They avoided roads and settlements, giving wide berth to any place where white people might spot them and raise an alarm. By the afternoon of the second day, they encountered their first real obstacle, a river wider and deeper than expected, swollen by recent rains. The guides had known they would need to cross water, but they had hoped to find a shallow ford. Instead, they faced a swift current that looked treacherous, perhaps deadly to those who couldn't swim, and many in the group had never had the opportunity to learn. A quick conference was held. They decided to cross at a point where the river narrowed slightly between two large rocks. Those who could swim would go first, carrying ropes to be secured on the far bank. Then they would create a human chain to help non-swimmers across, holding tight to the ropes to avoid being swept away. The crossing took nearly 2 hours and almost ended in disaster multiple times. An elderly man named Joseph lost his footing and was pulled under, only saved by Marcus, a blacksmith, who dove in and pulled him to the surface. A young woman named Rachel was swept downstream and barely managed to catch hold of a rock, where she clung terrified until rescuers reached her. But eventually, miraculously, all 37 people made it across, soaked and shivering but alive. On the far bank, they allowed themselves a brief rest. Abigail sat with her back against a tree, wringing water from her dress and trying to warm herself in the late afternoon sun. She looked at the faces around her, people who had risked everything, who had left behind the only homes they had known, who had chosen the terrifying uncertainty of freedom over the predictable horror of slavery. She felt fierce pride in them and in herself, mixed with an overwhelming sense of responsibility for what they had set in motion. As night fell, they continued moving. The guides estimated they had covered nearly 40 miles from the Thornton plantation, putting significant distance between themselves and immediate pursuit. But they also knew that word would have spread by now, that slave catchers might have been hired, that the full apparatus of slave-owning society would be mobilized to recapture them. On the third day of travel, they received confirmation that they were being pursued. One of the scouts, a young man named Isaiah, returned with urgent news. A group of mounted men, at least 8 of them, were moving through the area behind them, clearly searching. They had dogs with them and were checking every possible hiding place, every patch of woods, every ravine. The group made an immediate decision to split up. 37 people moving together left too obvious a trail, made too much noise, were too easy to spot. They divided into 5 smaller groups that would travel on slightly different routes, planning to reunite at a predetermined location farther north if possible. This way, if one group was caught, the others might still escape. Abigail found herself in a group of 7: Solomon, Miriam, Esther, a young man named Samuel Dinah, the healer, and Marcus, the blacksmith. They moved with increased caution now, knowing pursuers were close. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day in caves, dense thickets, or abandoned structures. They ate sparingly, stretching meager supplies and supplementing them with berries, roots, and whatever small game Marcus could trap. On the 5th day after leaving the plantation, they had their closest call with capture. They were resting in a dense stand of trees when they heard dogs in the distance, hounds baying as they picked up a scent, followed by men's shouts urging them on. The group froze, every person holding their breath, praying the dogs would pass without detecting them. The sounds grew closer, close enough to hear individual voices shouting commands. Marcus quietly readied a large stick, preparing to fight if necessary. Abigail's hand went to the knife she had taken from the Thornton kitchen, a small blade that would be almost useless against armed men, but which gave her some slight sense of not being completely defenseless. Then, miraculously, the sounds began to recede. The dogs had picked up a different scent or been directed down a different path. The pursuers moved away, their voices fading into the distance. The group remained frozen for another hour before finally allowing themselves to breathe normally again. That night, as they continued their journey, Solomon spoke words that captured what everyone was feeling. "We're ghosts now, moving through a world that wants to catch us and chain us. But we're slipping through their fingers like smoke. Every day we stay free is a victory. Every mile we travel is a prayer answered." By the end of the first week, Abigail's group had covered nearly 80 miles. They were exhausted, hungry, their clothes in tatters, their bodies covered in scratches and insect bites. But they were still free, still moving, still clinging to the hope that had driven them to run in the first place. They had passed beyond the immediate area of the Thornton plantation and were now traveling through territory where their specific identities might not be known, where they were just nameless runaways rather than the specific people who had escaped from the Thornton estate. They began to encounter signs of the war that had seemed so distant when they were enslaved. They passed through areas where Confederate troops had recently camped, seeing remains of campfires and discarded equipment. They heard distant artillery fire from battles being fought to the east. They saw farms abandoned or destroyed, crops rotting in fields, houses burned by one army or the other. The landscape itself told the story of a society tearing itself apart. And within that chaos, they found opportunities. They raided abandoned farmhouses for food and supplies. They encountered other escaped slaves who shared information about routes and dangers. They even received help from a few brave souls, both black and white, willing to risk their own safety to aid fugitives seeking freedom. On the 10th day after leaving the plantation, they crossed into Arkansas. The border meant little in practical terms. Slavery existed on both sides, and danger remained constant. But psychologically, it felt significant, as if they had passed from one chapter into another. It was here that they finally received solid information about where Union lines actually were, An elderly black man living in a small cabin miles from any town told them that federal troops were operating about 60 miles to the northeast, that they had established camps and were accepting escaped slaves who made it to their lines. He drew them a rough map in the dirt, warning them about areas where Confederate patrols operated. "You're close now," the old man said. "Closer than you think. But these last miles might be the hardest. The Confederates know slaves are running toward Union lines, so they watch those approaches carefully. You'll need to be smart, careful, lucky." Armed with this information, Abigail's group pushed forward with renewed energy despite exhaustion. 60 miles. It seemed both impossibly far and tantalizingly close. 60 miles between slavery and freedom, between the past and the future, between who they had been forced to be and who they might choose to become. They traveled for 3 more days, moving with extreme caution through increasingly militarized territory. They saw Confederate patrols and hid in ditches until they passed. They heard the sounds of skirmishes in the distance and detoured around them. They moved through a landscape scarred by war, where the old order was visibly crumbling but where danger remained at every turn. On the 13th day after leaving the Thornton plantation, as dawn was breaking over a ridge of hills, they saw something that made their hearts leap: the flag of the United States flying over a distant encampment. The Union lines. After nearly 2 weeks of constant travel, of fear and exhaustion and determination, they had reached their destination. They approached cautiously, still half afraid it might be a trap or mirage. But as they drew closer, they could see Union soldiers, men in blue uniforms who watched them approach with curiosity rather than hostility. When they finally walked into the camp, announcing they were escaped slaves seeking freedom, they were greeted not with chains but with food, water, and the simple acknowledgement of their humanity. A Union officer took their names and stories, writing everything down in careful record. When he came to Abigail, she spoke her name clearly and added something else. "I am Abigail of Texas. I was enslaved on the Thornton plantation for 14 years. Before I escaped, I gave my mistress 10 lashes at the same tree where she had me whipped. I want that written down. I want it remembered." The officer paused, his pen hovering over the paper, then nodded slowly and wrote it all down. "It will be remembered," he said. "I'll make sure of it." In the days that followed, Abigail learned that 4 of the 5 groups that had split off from the main escape party had made it to Union lines. 31 of the original 37 people who had fled had successfully escaped. 6 had been recaptured or had died during the journey, their names added to the countless other casualties of a system built on human bondage. Solomon was among those who had made it, as were Miriam, Esther, Samuel, Dinah, and Marcus. They had all survived the journey, though they bore the physical and psychological scars of both their years in slavery and their desperate flight to freedom. They were placed in a contraband camp, the term used for escaped slaves who had reached Union lines, where they would work for wages, receive basic education, and begin the long process of building new lives. Abigail's story spread through the camp and beyond. The tale of the slave woman who had whipped her mistress before escaping became a powerful symbol of resistance and justice. It was repeated in slave quarters throughout the region, carried by the invisible networks of communication that connected enslaved communities. Some versions were exaggerated. In some tellings, Abigail had beaten Catherine nearly to death or had rallied all the slaves to rise in rebellion. But the core truth remained. A woman who had been powerless had seized power, if only for a moment, and had lived to tell the tale. Catherine Thornton survived her whipping, though she never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of being bound and beaten by someone she had considered her property. According to reports that filtered through to Abigail months later, Catherine had become increasingly unbalanced after the incident, jumping at shadows and refusing to be alone with any of the remaining slaves. When Union forces eventually reached eastern Texas and slavery finally collapsed, Catherine fled to relatives in Georgia, leaving behind the plantation that had been her kingdom. George Thornton returned from settling his brother's affairs to find his plantation in chaos, his wife traumatized, and a significant portion of his slave labor force gone. He attempted to maintain operations, but the combination of war, escape, and eventual emancipation destroyed the economic foundation of his enterprise. The Thornton plantation, which had seemed so permanent and powerful, was swept away by the currents of history like a house built on sand. Abigail spent the remaining years of the Civil War in various contraband camps and later in communities of newly freed people. She learned to write as well as read, becoming a teacher for children who had been born into slavery and needed education to navigate their new reality as free citizens. She never married, never had children of her own, but she became a mother figure to dozens of young people who called her Miss Abigail and came to her for advice and guidance. In the years after the war, during the brief period of Reconstruction when Black Americans had some measure of political power and legal protection, Abigail gave testimony about her experiences in slavery. She spoke at church and community meetings, telling her story not as a tale of personal revenge, but as an example of resistance and the fundamental human dignity that no system of oppression could completely extinguish. She always emphasized the same points: that what she had done to Catherine Thornton was not primarily about revenge, but about forcing one person who had wielded absolute power over others to understand, even briefly, what it felt like to be powerless. That the whipping was a reversal of unjust power, a symbolic act that pointed toward the larger justice that needed to be achieved in society. That true freedom required not just the end of slavery, but the creation of a new social order built on equality and mutual respect. Abigail lived to be 67 years old, dying in 1898, 35 years after her escape from the Thornton plantation. She spent those decades working for the advancement of her community, teaching, organizing, and preserving the stories of those who had suffered under slavery and fought for freedom. She never forgot the names of those who had died in bondage, who had been sold away, who had been whipped at the tree. She carried their memories with her and told their stories so they would not be lost to history. The whipping tree on the Thornton plantation still stood decades after the end of slavery, a silent witness to both the cruelty of the past and the resistance that had ultimately overcome it. It became something of a landmark in the area, and people would point it out to visitors with stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some said the tree was cursed, that it would never bear leaves again after what it had witnessed. Others said it was blessed, a monument to the strength of those who had suffered there and survived. Abigail's story, like so many stories from the era of slavery and the Civil War, was eventually forgotten by the broader culture, buried under the weight of lost cause mythology and national amnesia about the realities of slavery. But it was preserved in the oral traditions of Black communities, passed down through generations as a reminder that resistance was possible, that justice could sometimes be achieved even in the most unjust circumstances, that the human spirit could not be completely broken no matter how brutal the oppression. In recent years, historians have begun to recover stories like Abigail's to document the countless acts of resistance and rebellion that challenged the institution of slavery. These stories reveal a truth that was long obscured, that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents in their own liberation, that they fought for freedom in ways both large and small, and that the end of slavery was not simply the result of white political decisions, but the culmination of generations of Black resistance and struggle. Abigail's act of whipping Catherine Thornton at the same tree where she herself had been whipped stands as a powerful symbol of that resistance. It was an act of poetic justice, a reversal of power that momentarily shattered the absolute authority that slavery had granted to white owners over black bodies. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, and yet it was also profoundly necessary. Necessary for Abigail's own sense of self and dignity. Necessary as an example to others who were deciding whether to accept their bondage or fight for freedom. The story reminds us that justice is not always delivered through official channels or legal systems. Sometimes justice comes from the oppressed themselves, from those who refuse to accept that might makes right, who insist on their own humanity even when society tells them they are less than human. Abigail's whipping of Catherine Thornton was not sanctioned by any court or law, but it carried a moral authority that came from the fundamental wrongness of the system it challenged. As we reflect on this story more than 160 years after these events, it challenges us to think about justice, power, and resistance in our own time. It asks us to consider what we would do in the face of absolute injustice, whether we would choose safety through submission or risk through resistance. It reminds us that the comfortable narratives we tell about history often obscure the harder truths about how change actually happens, how freedom is actually won. Abigail of Texas, the slave woman who whipped her mistress on the same tree of her pain, deserves to be remembered not as an aberration or exception, but as one example among thousands of people who refuse to accept their designated place in an unjust hierarchy. Her story is part of the larger story of how slavery was challenged and eventually destroyed, how a nation was forced to confront the contradiction between its stated ideals of freedom and the reality of human bondage. In the end, Abigail's greatest victory was not the whipping itself, but the fact that she escaped to freedom, lived a long life, and was able to tell her own story in her own words. She went from being property to being a person with legal rights, from being silenced to being a teacher and speaker, from being powerless to being an agent of change in her community. The whipping was one moment in a much longer journey, but it was a moment that defined her, that showed both to herself and to others that even in the darkest circumstances, resistance was possible. If you found Abigail's story of courage and resistance moving and important, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you more untold stories from history that challenge us to think differently about the past and its continuing relevance to our present. Comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community. Your support helps us continue recovering and sharing these powerful narratives that deserve to be remembered and honored. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.